Hey guys, today I'm going to be reviewing the new Logic album, New Pressure. I gotta say right off the bat, Logic has a pretty bumpy track record in my opinion, with some of his earlier material being much more true to his sound, but then with albums like Supermarket, he kind of started to stray away from that, and his quality started to diminish. So, going into this, I wasn't sure where he wanted to go. I mean, this is his final album. He's made it clear this is going to be his last album. So, I decided I would give this a chance and would put it into consideration for reviewing. And I gotta say, for the most part, there is a return to form in a way. I will say that he does kind of play into a lot of the more traditional hip hop stuff that, he kind of started off with. And even though it is a nice return to form from some of his other albums that he put out recently, it doesn't really bring too much new to the table overall. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the largest criticism because it's not necessarily like it is that horrible of an album. It's just I don't feel that it brings much new to the table. Lyrically, this album does really talk a lot about giving up the fame, giving up the big music. He's, talking about how he's going to miss a lot of it, but he also is glad that he's moving on with his life. But even though there are some pretty classic vibes throughout, there are some pretty focused lyrics. Not every song is as well executed. However, there are a handful of them that I do think are. The song Hit My Line, I think, is the best on here. I think it is a highlight. It has good lyrics, it has a good hook, a good chorus, and I really like the beat. I like the distorted bass, and I just think it's the best song on here. I will notice that a lot throughout this album is how I do think that actually the instrumentals of a lot of these tracks are actually better than the vocals that are being delivered over them. A lot of the sampling I enjoy quite a bit. Throughout Celebration, for example, has some really good, I'm not sure if it's 100% sampling, but it has that sound to it, an old sound being revamped into a newer song. And I really like the way the instrumental turns out on that song, on Soul Food 2, on Man I Is. These are all good instrumentals, and it sort of adds to the feel and the vibe of the album. And speaking of the vibe of the album, it has an overall chilled out vibe in some spots, but that doesn't mean that there's not some crazy songs here and there. There is definitely some songs where instrumentally it's a bit more upbeat, a bit more in your face. But for the most part, he does follow through with a pretty conventional, very classic hip-hop sounding palette, but sort of a bit of a chilled out one. However, what about Logic? What about his delivery? What about his lyrics and his rapping? Well, to me, Logic has always been a pretty talented rapper. That's never been the reason why I've had issues with his music. A lot of my issues with his music come from him straying far away from the sound and him embarrassing himself. And he doesn't really do that too much on here. I mean, his rapping on this album is pretty good. And there are some spots where he raps pretty fast. And I always have some issues with the fast rapping. Now, I have this issue with Eminem a lot too, and I do find a lot of similarities between Logic and Eminem's music. But sometimes the fast rapping does take away from the music a bit, and it kind of sucks. Not that it's bad, it just takes away from the overall feel and lyrics of the song. But for the most part, Logic does follow through with a pretty solid delivery on here, some pretty good rapping, nothing too bad or cringy that I can't see past. And for the most part, I actually will give Logic some good credit for the overall feel of this album and the overall talent behind this album. It's clear that he is a talented artist, and this definitely shows. Now, like I said, though, there are just some songs on here, there are some parts of this album that fall short of great. GP4, I just thought was a very average song. I thought that the delivery, and it kind of blends in with a lot of the other songs on this album. I just feel like it falls short of great, and unfortunately a lot of this album does. A lot of this album just kind of feels like he's returning to form, but with nothing new added, and unfortunately that does hurt this album even the slightest bit. This is his final album. This is his swan song. Do I think this is a good way to to close your discography? I don't think it's bad. I think that Logic definitely did hit us with a better album than his past few albums, but I still don't think it's necessarily near his greatest works. And a lot of it still comes off as if he's just returning to form to please people, for his last album, and I don't necessarily get authentic vibes from every single part of this album. I know this is a shorter review, but I just felt like I was able to come to an opinion on this album much sooner than a lot of other albums I do review. And because of that, I have been able to come to a conclusion as to how I feel about this album pretty fast. And I have settled on giving this album let's see, a light 6 out of 10. Yeah, I mean, this album is above average. 5 is my average point. Anything above is good, but I just don't think Logic really delivers nearly as much as I think he could have. I think that overall it was a good ending to his career in music, and I do appreciate the album. I just don't find it that intriguing overall. I feel like there's a lot of elements that I've heard before with nothing much added. Unfortunately, though, this is his final album, and that is it for now. Goodbye.